The wind blew strangely that morning, the kind of wind that smelled like burning coal and nuts and carried whispers to heavy for the ears of the living. And as Ikong stood barefoot on the red earth outside his hut in Yumuoko, the hair on the back of his neck rose like it used to when Idana would warn him of omens in her sleep. Only she had been dead for 6 seasons now, buried beneath the old fig tree with her wrists tied in white cloth, as the elders demanded for women who spoke to shadows. Yet every Tuesday since the last Harmattan, a letter had arrived in her delicate script, folded neatly and tucked under the crooked mortar where she used to grind pepper. And though the villagers believed Ikong had lost his mind with grief, he never showed them the envelopes or the black powder that clung to their folds like dried soot. And he never read them aloud, for the words inside spoke of a comb carved from the spine of a drowned priestess and passed down by his grandmother, Ngozi, who had once danced backward during the New Yam Festival and bitten a goat's ear clean off in a trance. The same grandmother who had vanished one rainy night with a basket full of crow feathers and returned years later looking younger than her own daughters, her eyes milky with secrets, her hands always clutching a comb that shimmered like oil in moonlight. A comb, she said, could pull time from the bones of the living if stroked through the right head at the right hour. And now, Adana wrote that the comb had awakened again, restless and cold, hiding somewhere in the house, hungry for youth, weaving itself into the strands of their daughter Igiama's hair. When she slept, draining the child's laughter until even the birds fell silent when she passed. And though Ikong wanted to burn the letters and run, each week her words returned, each one darker than the last, warning of bones cracking under invisible weight, of ancestors twisting in their graves, of a curse older than fire that now stirred beneath the floorboards, curling around his feet and whispering in a voice that was not hers. Not anymore. That night, Ikong did not sleep but sat cross-legged on the mat Adana had woven in her final days. The same mat where she used to hum songs about moon spirits and oil harvests, while threading cowrie shells into Igiama's braids. And as the fire in the hearth dimmed to a whisper, he placed the latest letter beside the others, each one now bound in a strip of palm frond as though tying them might bind the evil, leaking through their ink. And outside, the frogs stopped singing all at once, every last one silenced as if the air had thickened with some ancient presence too heavy for song. And then he heard the faint dragging sound again, like fingernails scratching the inside of wood, coming from the base of the shrine where his grandmother's ochre-stained stool sat undisturbed for 20 years. And when he crept toward it, bare feet pressing soft indentations into the clay floor, he saw it. Just barely half buried in the cracked earth was a sliver of glinting bone, carved into the shape of a tooth, or perhaps a spine. And the moment his fingers brushed it, a burst of cold surged up his arm, and behind his eyes flashed the image of Ngozi, younger than he remembered, her mouth full of beetles, laughing as she combed the hair of a faceless girl, whose shadow twitched against a wall of dancing flames. And Ikong screamed, dropping the shard as the fire pit burst into blue flame, and a gust of wind blew the door wide open, carrying with it the scent of blood and jasmine. And before he could move, Igioma stumbled into the hut clutching her head, her eyes wide and wild, hair standing as though lightning lived inside it, her voice broken as she cried, "Baba, it's in my dreams again, the comb, it's eating them." And when he pulled her into his arms, he felt the heat of fever and the pulsing energy beneath her scalp, like something growing there, writhing, ancient, and insatiable. And for the first time in years he whispered a prayer to the river goddess Muonta, whom his father had once angered by killing a 3-eyed fish, and who now, perhaps, could be the only spirit strong enough to sever a curse that lived not in objects but in blood. because the letters had not come from Adana's soul, but from something wearing her love like a cloak. Something that knew how to speak in her softness. Something that needed the comb to finish what Ngozi began, and Ikong, heart-pounding, knew then that unless he found the original comb before the next full moon, his daughter would wake up with someone else's voice in her throat. Image prompt: a young African girl with wild, glowing hair trembling beside a fire pit burning with blue flames inside a shadowed clay hut. Animated image be dawn. Ikong had wrapped Ijeoma in a raffia shawl, her skin burning like coal beneath rainwater, and he carried her through the mist-laced bush path that twisted between baobab trees and whispering termite mounds, past the sleeping drums of Umuoko, where the elders' masks hung heavy with dust and secrets. The villagers had long stopped seeking his company, ever since the night they heard him singing to Adana's grave during the moon eclipse. But now he passed them like a ghost, his daughter limp on his back, and only Maman Kiru, the blind widow, who sold ash soap near the crossroads, raised her hand to the wind and muttered, "The comb calls blood again," though her words were swallowed by the rustling leaves. Ikong did not stop until he reached the grove of Osisindu, the sacred grove where no man dared tread unless summoned by vision or madness, and he dug with his bare hands into the base of the oldest tree, a twisted iroko said to hold the memory of every broken promise in the land, and buried beneath its roots, wrapped in blackened goat hide, he found the gourd his grandmother had once warned him never to open unless he wished to see her true face, and he opened it. What spilled out was not liquid but a swarm of whispers, voices of unborn children and weeping ancestors. And at the center of the swirl was a single hair-thick silver, still warm as though just pulled from a living scalp, and as he touched it, time seemed to fold, and he was a boy again, peeking through the hut wall as Ngozi combed her hair with the bone comb under moonlight, her reflection in the brass bowl showing not her own face but that of a shriveled girl, crying out for her mother. And in the present, Ikong staggered back as blood poured from his ears and Ijeoma screamed from his back, thrashing as if snakes coiled around her spirit, her mouth uttering chants in a dialect no one had spoken in centuries. The ground trembled then, and the tree's roots shifted to reveal carvings names etched deep into the wood, all women from his bloodline, ending with Adana's and then, freshly marked in sap, Ijeoma's. And Ikong fell to his knees, knowing now the comb was not just cursed but alive, feeding off the youngest of each generation to keep Ngozi's soul anchored in the realm of breath, and that unless the chain was broken, Ijeoma would be the next vessel, her childhood scraped away, until nothing but Ngozi's hunger wore her face. He rose with fire in his chest, whispering to the spirits of the grove to bear witness, vowing to find the comb, to burn it in the mouth of the volcano beyond the river of crocodiles. And as he turned to leave, a shadow detached from the tree trunk and followed them silently, wearing a necklace of infant teeth. The path to the river of crocodiles was not a path but a memory, half forgotten by the land and barely whispered by the elders who once feared its banks. And Ikong, with Ijeoma still burning against his back like a coal wrapped in flesh, walked for 3 days through a heat so thick it blurred the trees into specters, and made the earth taste like iron, guided only by the letters he no longer opened but carried like talismans, their ink smudging his fingertips with curses and truths. And behind them, always just out of sight, moved the shadow with the infant teeth, never closer, never far, always waiting. And on the 4th evening, they reached the carved stones that marked the descent into Ubonkita, the gorge said to lead to the river where crocodiles never slept, and the spirits of drowned twins wailed for their lost names. And as they entered, The air turned cold, though the sun still burned above, and Igioma's eyes opened suddenly. Her irises now pale as millet. Her lips cracked with old chants that spoke of time unmaking itself. And Ikong knew the transformation had begun. That Ngozi's hunger was already threading into the girl's bones. And still he pressed forward, stepping over bones, feathers, and broken calabashes until the roar of rushing water rose up to meet them. Not a river's sound, but a song, deep and wet, sung in 1,000 stolen tongues. And the river appeared not as a stream, but a yawning throat of black water, lined with stone statues of children mid-scream. And among them, standing perfectly dry atop a floating mat of lilies, was the river priestess, Nanya the Bone-Eyed, her skin painted in white clay patterns that shimmered like scales, her voice hollow as she spoke without moving her mouth, telling Ikong that the comb he sought had passed this way, carried by a red goat with a human face, and if he wished to destroy it, he must enter the mouth of dust, an ancient volcanic cave hidden beyond the eastern ridge. But to pass the river safely, he must first offer a truth he had never spoken aloud. Ikong, chest heaving, fell to his knees and whispered how he had once begged the gods for Adana's death, when he feared she had taken his secrets to the spirits, and how he had buried the real comb years ago in her grave, hoping the earth would swallow it forever. And when he looked up, the statues wept red tears and the river parted down its center, revealing a bridge of skulls polished smooth by centuries of footsteps. And as he crossed it with Igioma silent in his arms, the shadow behind them let out a laugh that sounded like a baby gasping its last breath, and the priestess dissolved into mist, leaving only her voice echoing, "Your debt walks beside you still, Ikong." The comb remembers. The land beyond the river of crocodiles grew strange with every step, the trees leaning inward as if listening to Ikong's breath, their bark tattooed with faces that shifted when he blinked too slowly, and even the birds had stopped singing, replaced by a low rustling that followed him from tree to tree like a gossiping wind. Igioma hadn't spoken since the crossing, her body still fevered but her face disturbingly calm, as though some older spirit had settled behind her eyes and was waiting for something to arrive. And Ikong, wearied and thin, followed the mountain's edge until he reached a series of jagged stones arranged in the shape of a spiral, too perfect to be nature's work where the mouth of dust was said to hide. And when he stepped into the spiral, the air grew thick with ash and the sun dimmed behind a veil of soot. And there it was, hidden between two boulders shaped like kneeling ancestors. The cave that breathed like a sleeping beast, its mouth exhaling heat and sorrow with every pulse. Inside, the walls were alive with echoes, not sounds but memory snippets of his mother crying, Adana laughing, the scream of his baby brother as he drowned in the river Ikong once lied about falling into. And the deeper he walked, the more the air shimmered with things that didn't belong to this world, faces of people long dead appearing in the cave mist, beckoning him toward a pit of glowing embers at the heart of the earth, where the cursed comb now hovered mid-air, suspended by unseen forces, spinning slowly like a predator choosing its prey. It was longer than he remembered, and darker, the teeth sharper, and as he reached for it, Igioma stirred and began to speak in Ngozi's voice, eerily calm, mocking, reminding him that the comb could not be destroyed by fire unless it had tasted its final air, and that to burn it now would only turn Igioma to salt, her soul unanchored and left to drift forever among the wandering spirits of unborn things. Ikong froze, hand trembling above the flames, torn between destroying the comb and saving his daughter's fading essence. And the shadow that had followed them all this way stepped into the light then. Tall, thin, with no eyes, just a mouth, filled with writhing centipedes, and it held out a second comb. identical to the first but dripping blood, and in a voice made of many children weeping at once. It offered a choice: burn one, keep one, and bear the price in flesh. And as the cave walls began to collapse inward like a giant throat closing, around them, Ikong whispered Adana's name, kissed Igioma's forehead, and reached for the comb with shaking hands, praying the ancestors would catch whatever part of him might fall. Ikong chose the blood-drenched comb, his fingers closing around its slick bone handle just as the ceiling of the mouth of dust began to weep molten ash, and without hesitation he hurled it into the pit of glowing embers. It screamed not a sound, but a rupture in the air that made the cave shake as though the earth itself was mourning. And instantly, Igioma collapsed beside him, breath shallow but hers once more. Her skin cooled and her eyes dark again, and Ikong gathered her in trembling arms, staring at the second comb that still hovered in the air like a question, untouched, humming softly, pulsing like a heartbeat. And the shadow creature gave a soundless bow, receding into the smoke with the fading centipede rattle of its teeth. And as it vanished, 100 childlike voices whispered one word over and over: debt, 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 until the cave went silent but for the crackling of fading fire. Ikong turned to leave, but the path had changed. The cave no longer led backward, only deeper, downward into a darkness pulsing with veins of red light. And he realized the mouth of dust was not just a place, but a transition, a test of offerings. And now that the cursed comb was burned, the price for its destruction would have to bloom, and it bloomed in pain. For Igioma began to convulse again, this time not from possession, but from something rooted in her blood, unraveling, something ancient dying inside her like a worm retreating from light. And Ikong carried her further into the red-lit tunnels, guided only by instinct and the whispers of the earth, until they emerged into a narrow gorge surrounded by towering cliffs, where the air shimmered with heat and spirits circled in bird form overhead, cawing like they were laughing. And before them stood a figure dressed in layered bark and horn Oba, Udin, the guardian of unclean spirits, neither man nor god, but the ancient watcher of all curses made by kin. And without speaking, Oba Udin raised his staff, and the remaining comb flew into his hand, where he snapped it in two and fed the pieces to the horn growing from his chest. And the ground swallowed the last of the comb's song, but his gaze fell on Ikong, and he spoke in a thunderous voice that made the cliffs weep dust. What you destroy in fire, you must bury in blood. A line must end, so a soul may live. Ikong understood then that the curse would not lift until one generation severed itself willingly. And he looked at Igioma, breathing now in broken rhythm, and wept, knowing he would give anything to keep her alive, even if it meant walking into the spiritual wildness where names are forgotten and bodies never return. And when Oba Udin pointed to a stream of red water trickling through the gorge, Ikong followed it with his daughter in arms, into the unknown where the living go to trade places with the dead. The stream of blood-colored water wound through the gorge like a vein exposed, pulsing with quiet power. And as Ikong stepped into it, cradling Igioma close to his chest, the surface hissed softly as if recognizing a debt being paid. And Oba Udin watched from the shadows, his antlered head tilted, his eyes like hollow gourds that had seen too many endings. The water was warm and slick, and each step Ikong took into its current pulled memories from his body: his first laugh as a child, the taste of palm wine at his naming ceremony, the way Adana used to braid her hair with crimson thread, all of it stripped gently, almost lovingly, as though the river wished to unmake him with kindness. And when he reached the center of the stream, the water rose to his waist and began to whisper, not in his language, but in that same forgotten tongue that had once poured from Igioma's fevered lips. The language of ancestors who had no graves, only stories carved into wind and stone. And in that moment, the sky above split with a jagged streak of blue lightning that revealed, if only for a breath, thousands of spirits watching from the cliffs, women with goat legs, children with eyes like burning coal, elders whose jaws were stitched shut with spiderweb, and they all leaned forward as Ikong placed Igioma into the water, her body floating briefly before being cradled by unseen arms beneath the surface. And she did not sink, nor did she drown, but instead began to glow faintly, like the flame of a dying lantern being coaxed to life. And Ikong turned to leave, his body now half shadow, his face losing shape. But Oba Udin blocked his path, lifting the horned staff and placing it against Ikong's chest, saying with a voice that shook the gorge, "To give life to the air is to end the line. You must leave your name behind." And Ikong nodded, stepping backward into the stream once more, letting the water swallow the last of his breath, until his form dissolved like ash caught in the wind, and all that remained was a ripple and a child floating quietly, her hair now dark as night and free of the comb's touch, her chest rising slowly with life reborn. Oba Udin turned and walked into the rocks, disappearing without a sound, and the spirits above melted back into the stone, leaving only silence and the soft trickle of water dyed red by sacrifice. And as the sun began to rise beyond the gorge, Igioma stirred, opening her eyes to a world emptied of her father but filled with the hum of ancient songs, no longer burdened by hunger. And she stood barefoot in the stream, alone but untouched, her name echoing softly through the canyon walls, carried by the wind like a prayer finished, the wind that lifted through the gorge as Igioma stepped out of the red stream did not feel like any wind she had known before. It was soft yet heavy, scented with roasted yam and ancient incense, carrying fragments of voices that had never belonged to the living. And though her feet touched stone, it was as if she walked on memory itself. Her limbs felt new, her mind clearer than ever, and yet something tugged at the edge of her soul like a thread left half knotted, the sense of absence sharp and echoing. For Ikong was no longer behind her, and though she didn't cry, her chest ached like a drum stretched too tightly, reverberating with silence. And above her, the cliffs had turned smooth, no longer haunted by the faces of spirits, but etched now with a single symbol, a broken comb resting beside a full moon. And as she turned away from the stream, her shadow no longer moved in sync with her body, slower, almost reluctant, as if something of Ngozi still lingered in the corners of her being, watching, waiting. She did not return the way they came, but instead followed a narrow trail that opened like a wound through the rocks, leading her into a dense forest where every tree bore beads tied in pairs, offerings from those who had once asked for fertility, health, vengeance, or secrets best left buried. And the forest spoke in creaks and rustles, its silence alive with stories and warnings. And just before nightfall, Igioma reached a clearing where an old woman stirred a pot beneath a canopy of bones, her back bent like a bow, her skin dark and tough like dried okra. And without lifting her eyes, the woman said, "You walk with the scent of both endings and beginnings, child," and invited her to sit. The woman, who called herself Mama Obidia, was one of the forgotten keepers, those left behind when their shrines were swallowed by flood or famine, and she had waited many seasons for the child, who would arrive carrying silence in her mouth and thunder in her bones. And as she stirred the pot, she told Igioma of the balance, how the world kept count of every exchange, every love given, every betrayal whispered, and how the dead sometimes gave too much and refused to fade, binding themselves to the living through objects like mirrors, anklets, or Combs, and Igioma, listening quietly, felt the name of her father settle deep in her belly like a drumbeat, steady and true. And for the first time since stepping into the stream, she spoke his name not in mourning, but as a vow, and the trees around the clearing shuddered slightly, shedding leaves in silence as if bowing to a truth finally spoken. And Mama Obidia nodded, whispering, "Then the real work begins." As night fell over the forest, Mama Obidia placed a strip of charcoal across Igioma's forehead and led her to a stone circle, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines, where 9 clay figurines stood arranged in a spiral, each carved in the likeness of a woman with hollow eyes and mouths open in eternal scream. And she explained that these were the ancestresses, who had bound their gifts too tightly to their descendants, letting power rot into greed, and that Ngozi had been their youngest and eager girl, who'd once danced barefoot into the sacred grove, and emerged with the comb carved from her sister's spine, gifted by a spirit that promised eternal youth in exchange for silence, a silence Ngozi never broke until she passed it into Adana's hands without warning, and now, through blood, into Igioma. The ritual to sever the final thread would require more than sacrifice. It would demand recognition, an acknowledgement of the wound's source and its echo. And so Mama Obidia handed Igioma a bowl of kola nut and river ash, telling her to eat and sleep within the stone circle, and that by dawn, if the ancestors allowed, the girl would see clearly the path forward, and if not, the forest would keep her as another whispering tree. Igioma obeyed, lying on the woven mat with the cold bowl beside her, staring up at the sky where no stars dared shine. And as her eyes grew heavy, dreams took her. But they were not dreams. She stood again in her father's hut, but everything was reversed. The fire burned blue, the walls breathed like lungs, and sitting on Adana's old stool was Ngozi, younger than any memory, her smile cruel and wide, combing a doll's hair that bled with each stroke. And Ngozi looked up and said, "So you think the end was mine? Foolish child. I only carried the curse. I did not cast it." And she beckoned Igioma to sit, to listen, and when she did, the story unfolded of a time before combs and letters, before names, when a woman made of mist had given birth to twins, one of earth and one of wind, and when the wine child vanished into the sky, the mother wept a comb into existence from her ribs, hoping to comb the clouds back down, but instead she combed away the youth of every daughter born after, until her story was forgotten, and the comb passed as inheritance, wrapped in beauty, fueled by longing, and now it called for one final memory to be unmade to sleep at last. And Igioma, heart thudding, asked whose memory, and Ngozi only smiled, turning to ash as the doll in her hands screamed in a voice that sounded like both Adana and Ikon. Igioma woke with a jolt, breath sharp, sweat pouring down her brow, and the bowl beside her was empty. The dawn that met Igioma's waking eyes was not warm but silver, the kind of light that bends through time. And as she rose from the mat surrounded by the clay figures of the ancestresses, she felt a stillness in her limbs that did not belong to sleep but to transformation, a sense that something had passed through her body like wind through tall grass, quiet but rearranging. And Mama Obidia stood just beyond the vine curtain watching her with eyes that looked older than the sun, nodding once, slowly, as if the girl's waking confirmed a prophecy she had long hidden in the folds of her wrapper. She beckoned Igioma toward a large drum resting under a termite-blackened tree, and began to beat it with one open palm, a rhythm that pulsed like a heartbeat made of thunder. And from the forest came movement, not people, but forms, spirits shaped like fireflies, women with skin like bark, children with bird wings where their arms should be drawn by the sound, to witness the next part of the unraveling. And Mama Obidia whispered that Ijeoma now bore the right to descend into the well of threads, the place where ancestral memory weaves itself into flesh and where she could name the true weaver of the curse. For only a name spoken in that place could cut through the bindings left by the mist woman's comb. And Ijeoma, without fear, asked for the path. Mama Obidia offered her a single white stone and told her to hold it tightly, for it would grow warm as she neared truth and cold as she veered into deception. And with nothing but her breath and the beat of the old drum to guide her, Ijeoma stepped beyond the clearing and into a path lined with silent statues, their hands held over their mouths as if mourning all the stories they had never been allowed to tell. The path narrowed until it was barely wide enough for her shoulders, the stone growing heavy in her hand, its warmth seeping into her bones. And soon she stood before a pool of black water, sunken into the ground, surrounded by white strings stretched across the surface like spider silk. And in the center of the pool hovered a single loom, its spindle turning slowly in air. And as Ijeoma stepped into the water, the strings clung to her arms, her legs, her neck, whispering names she had never heard before: Nwulu, Amaka, or Anachi, each voice belonging to a woman who had once carried the comb. And in the center of the loom appeared the face of the mist woman, neither young nor old, her eyes swirling with stars, and she looked at Ijeoma not with cruelty, but with exhaustion, mouthing a name Ijeoma could not yet hear. And the girl understood she was not just here to unbind a curse but to inherit the memory that made it necessary in the first place. The name fluttered to her lips before she could even think to speak it: Chinelo. And the word left Ijeoma's mouth like a ripple across the water's skin, causing every thread in the pool to vibrate with sudden tension, as though they recognized the name not as a curse but as a confession. The loom in the center trembled, its spindle spinning faster, and from it emerged a vision vivid and sharp like lightning behind closed eyes of a woman with skin like burnt bronze and hair like braided thunder, seated before a fire, weaving stories into her hair as if it were a book. And Ijeoma understood that Chinelo was not the origin of the curse, but its guardian, the keeper of its memory and pain. And she saw then how grief had folded over itself across generations, passed from woman to woman like a sealed gourd no one dared open, until it reached her mother, then her, and now begged to be undone. The mist woman's eyes faded from the loom as the threads loosened and drifted across the water like feathers, and Ijeoma stepped back, soaked and shivering, the stone in her palm now glowing with a steady, calm warmth, no longer a guide but a keepsake, a sign she had chosen rightly. And as she walked back through the corridor of silent statues, one of them moved for the first time, lowering its hand from its mouth and releasing a long-held breath that echoed like wind through bones. And behind her, the sound of the loom unraveling carried on the air like distant thunder softening into rain. At the clearing, Mama Obidia waited, her eyes wet with quiet pride, and she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small brass pendant shaped like an open eye, and placed it around Ijeoma's neck, saying, "You are no longer a question, my child. You are an answer waiting to be spoken." And with that, the women began their walk down the mountain trail, their steps slow but sure, toward a village still thick with silence and suspicion, where Ezeku sat alone in his compound, a letter unopened in his hand, unable to bear the words he feared it would carry, the goats bleating softly nearby, the sun sinking behind the raffia roof in slanted golden bars. And when Ijeoma finally reached the threshold of his compound, she did not knock, she simply stood there, holding the white stone in one hand and the memory of Chinelo in the other, waiting for him to look up and see her. And when he did, something inside him broke and healed at the same time. Like a pot cracked and rejoined with gold, the beginning of a story neither of them fully understood yet, but would now begin to write together. For a long while, neither Ijeoma nor Ezeku spoke. The silence between them stretched like a tight drum skin, holding every word, every breath, every tremble of emotion too sacred to spill. The compound smelled of rain-soaked earth and old palm wine, and Ezeku looked older than she remembered, his once dark beard now streaked with ash gray, his eyes hollowed not just by grief but by the weight of unspoken truths. In his hand was the latest letter, unopened, its corner damp from the sweat of his fingers. Ijeoma stepped forward and gently took it from him, placing the envelope beside the shrine of woven cowries and cola nuts near the doorway. "She's not haunting you," Ijeoma said softly, "not as a warning but as a balm. She's remembering you. She's waiting for you to remember her truly." Ezeku's lips parted as if to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. He turned away from her and sat on the low wooden stool, his shoulders hunched like an old hawk drying its wings. "I buried her myself," he whispered, finally. 3 days under the akbakoro tree. I poured oil into the roots. I said goodbye. But the letters, he paused, looking toward the shrine. They keep coming. Always on Wednesdays. Ijeoma sat beside him on the bare earth, the hem of her wrapper stained with the journey. "Because something of her is still here," she said. "Not her ghost, her ache. The part of her that could not rest because you wouldn't let yourself grieve properly. You buried her body, but not your sorrow. You folded it into a story to need to be true." The silence that followed was not empty, but full of breeze, of memories, of fireflies blinking in the gathering dusk. Then Ezeku looked at her again, really looked, and something in his expression softened. "You went to find her," he said, more statement than question. Ijeoma nodded. "And I found myself too." She reached into her cloth bag and pulled out a bundle tied with black thread letters, not written by Chinello, but about her. Journal pages, recipes, snatches of stories Ijeoma had gathered from women in the hills, from elders who remembered the way Chinello used to laugh when she danced, from girls who still tied their hair with cloth patterned like hers. "This," Ijeoma said, handing him the bundle, "is the part of her you forgot. The part not in your grief, but in your love." Ezeku took it with shaking hands, the last of the sun setting behind him, casting long shadows that seemed less heavy now. And then, as if on cue, the wind blew through the compound gate and across their faces, warm and salt-sweet, like breath held and finally released. The next morning began with the cries of the Iba, the village rooster whose call never lied. And for the first time in months, Ezeku woke before it did. The bundle of letters Ijeoma had given him lay untouched on the mat beside his head, though his dreams had been thick with the voices of the women whose memories had stitched them together. He rose slowly, joints crackling like dry cassava peels, and stepped outside into the gray light of dawn. The compound felt different, not just because of the rain-slicked soil or the drifting scent of burnt plantain from a neighbor's hearth, but because something inside him had shifted, cracked open like a ground nut shell, revealing a tender middle. Ijeoma was already at the well, drawing water in the rhythmic, purposeful way only those raised in the village understood. "You didn't read them," she said without turning. Ezeku lowered his eyes. "Not yet. I'm afraid they'll show me things I should have known when she was alive." Ijeoma dropped the bucket into the well with a heavy splash. "Then, it's time you stop being afraid." Later, after breakfast boiled yam with palm oil and salt, he returned to the mat, took the top page of the bundle, and began to read. The first was a story from an old market woman who had once taught Chinelo how to haggle. She would smile at the yams and insult them in Igbo so sweetly that the seller always laughed and dropped the price. The woman had written. Another came from a girl who had learned to sew by watching Chinelo mend clothes for the elders for free, saying every thread was a prayer. Ezeku read them slowly, one by one, each line unraveling the hardened grief he had wrapped around himself like a goatskin drum. Left too long in the sun, he could see her now, clearer than ever, not just the woman who died coughing in his arms, but the one who danced in the rain, who scolded chickens for pecking at her herbs, who tucked cassava chips into children's palms when no one was looking. As he reached the final letter, the one written in Igiama's handwriting, he paused. It was not a letter at all, but a question. Will you write her one in return? That evening, with the moon like a polished calabash above his head, Ezeku sat beneath the akbakoro tree where he had buried her and put pen to paper. His hand trembled at first, then steadied. He told her about his days since she left, about how he had withered, about Igioma, about the memories returned to him like birds that never forgot the path home. And when he was done, he folded the letter and tucked it into the red clay at the base of the tree. The wind that passed through the branches carried no reply, but he didn't need one anymore. When Ezeku returned to the house, the moonlight still glistening on his fingers from where he had pressed the letter into the earth, he felt a lightness in his chest he hadn't known in years. As if by writing to Chinelo, he had loosened some final knot binding his sorrow. That night, he didn't dream of her coughing or fading or staring blankly into the ceiling as the sickness took hold. Instead, he saw her laughing, truly laughing beneath the mango tree near their old hut, her wrapper soaked in juice as she handed slices of fruit to Igioma and the children from the neighborhood. And though the scent of death still lingered faintly in the corners of his memory, like old coal and nut peelings in a gourd, the weight of it no longer silenced him. Morning came with a softness in the air, and Ezeku did something he hadn't done in a long while. He sang, just under his breath, a slow Igbo tune his grandmother once used to lull babies to sleep, his voice dry but steady, until Igioma peeked her head into the hut, eyes wide. "Is that you making all that music?" she asked, arms folded, but smiling. "You think your voice can wake the ancestors?" He chuckled and motioned for her to come inside. She saw the mat scattered with the letters and the dried streaks, where his tears had fallen the night before. "You've changed," she said, kneeling beside him. "No," he replied, "I've remembered." Later that day, they walked to the stream together, not speaking much, but their silence was no longer hollow. Children ran past, goats bleated along the path, and an old man sitting under a raffia shade offered them roasted maize from his fire. The world seemed to be waiting for Ezeku to step into it again. At the stream, as he washed his face, he whispered to the water, "She is still here." Igioma looked at him but said nothing. On their way back, she handed him a folded scrap of paper, a letter she had written to Chinelo, thanking her for helping a stranger come back to life. Ezeku didn't read it aloud, but he tucked it with the others. That evening, before the sun could disappear completely, he returned to the akbakoro tree with the letters wrapped in cloth and buried them all there, in the same place he had written his own. This time, there was no prayer, no plea, no ache, only gratitude. And when he stood to go, he reached for Igioma's hand, not to hold onto something lost, but to walk forward with someone still here. A few days after burying the bundle of letters beneath the akbakoro tree, Ezeku began to rise with the dawn, not because grief woke him, but because the rhythm of the earth seemed to call him back into it. He started tending his overgrown yam mounds again, knees deep in the red soil, humming the same lullaby he had once sung to his son in the cradle. Ijeoma would sometimes bring him roasted plantains and coconut water, sitting at a safe distance with her legs folded neatly beneath her wrapper, watching without interrupting. The villagers had begun to notice the change in him, how he greeted the old men at the palm wine joint again, how he lingered in the market just a little longer, how he stopped to pet a stray goat like a man no longer in hiding. One afternoon, as the harmattan wind rolled in dry and gold-tinted, Ezeku walked with Ijeoma to the edge of the village, where the young masquerade dancers were rehearsing. The children giggled and hid behind trees, peeking at the two of them, whispering stories of the widower who once lived like a ghost but now moved like a man reborn. An elder woman named Mama Nkechi approached Ezeku as he leaned against a wooden post, her face marked with the deep lines of long laughter and longer sorrow. "You carry her in your eyes still," she said, resting her hand on his shoulder. "But now you have space for the living too." He nodded, not with the shame he once felt, but with acceptance. That night, the sky turned dark with rain clouds, and thunder rumbled like ancestral drums across the hills. As lightning flashed and the downpour began, Ezeku and Ijeoma lit a lamp and stayed in, sitting close by the window, listening to the storm like it was music meant for just the two of them. They did not speak much, just drank warm ginger tea and watched the rain dance across the thatched rooftops. At some point, Ezeku reached into a drawer and pulled out Chinello's final letter, the one that had arrived weeks ago and remained unopened. He looked at it for a long time, then gently unfolded it, the candle's flame casting flickering shadows across the ink. Her words were short this time, almost like a whisper across time. "You are free now. You can love again. And that too is part of how you remember me. I will always walk beside you. Let the living touch your hand. Let the wind carry me." Ezeku smiled through the tears that welled up in his eyes, then passed the letter to Ijeoma without a word. She read it, pressed it to her heart, and blew out the lamp, leaving them both wrapped in darkness and the quiet, healing sound of the rain. The morning after the rain, the village seemed scrubbed clean, its clay paths glistening, the leaves of the breadfruit trees sparkling with beads of water. Ezeku stepped out of his home barefoot, the coolness of the damp earth grounding him as birds called softly from the canopy. He hadn't dreamt of Chinello the night before, and that realization sat strangely on his chest, not painful, just quiet, like the silence after a drumbeat fades. Ijeoma emerged behind him, tying her wrapper at the waist, her hair still wet from washing. She handed him a carved wooden bowl of millet porridge without asking if he wanted any, and he took it with a slight smile, grateful for the ordinary gesture. Later that day, they made their way to the shrine of Annie, the earth goddess, where the villagers were preparing for the annual New Yam festival. Ezeku hadn't participated in years, but this time he offered to help string up garlands of palm fronds and hang dyed wrappers on the elders' stools. As he worked, several of the youths whispered behind cupped hands, some curious, others mischievous. After all, it was not every day that a widower worked side by side with a woman not yet his wife. Elder Okafor approached him, tapping his staff once on the ground. "We see your hands again in the village, Ezeku. That is good, but we also see your heart. What will you do with it now?" The question lingered, not as pressure, but as an open door. That evening, as the sun lowered behind the baobab trees and the drummers began testing their rhythms, Ezeku sat beneath the same akpakoro tree where he had buried Chinello's letters. Igioma sat beside him, plucking small wild flowers and twirling them between her fingers. He looked at her, his gaze long and unhurried, then said softly, "I never thought I would live past her, not like this. But you have made me live in a way that even the dead would smile upon." Igioma turned her face slightly, her eyes shimmering with something fragile but strong. "We don't replace the ones we lose, Ezeku. We only carry them differently." They sat there in a silence so rich it felt like a prayer, listening to the first firecrackers of the festival echo in the distance. Somewhere deep in the fields, someone released a flock of white doves, their wings catching the light as they rose into the sky, feathered symbols of peace and renewal. Ezeku watched them until they vanished beyond the clouds, and then he reached for Igioma's hand, not with trembling, but with certainty, like a man who had walked through fire and come out not unburned, but unbroken. The following morning, as the village stirred with the soft clang of mortar and pestle and the rustle of cassava leaves being swept from courtyards, Ezeku awoke to the quiet thud of something at his doorstep. His breath caught in his throat, even before he moved. For weeks now, the letters had slowed, first daily, then weekly, then not at all, and he had started to believe, just faintly, that perhaps Chinello's spirit had finally settled. But there it was again, a fresh envelope, folded neatly. Her name written in that same delicate hand he once traced in the quiet hours of marriage. He picked it up slowly, heart thick with dread and longing. Igioma was still asleep inside, her breath soft and even. He didn't want to read the letter. Not yet, not with her near. Instead, he tucked it into his wrapper and stepped out into the bush path that led to the river, where the mist still clung to the grass like old memories, refusing to lift. Under the tall iroko tree where he and Chinello used to sit and dream about their children, he opened the envelope. This one was different, shorter, the ink blotchy, almost rushed. "You are almost free," it read, "but you must finish what you began." There was no name, no sign-off, no fragrance pressed into the paper as before, just that cryptic line. Ezeku's fingers trembled. What had he begun? Was it mourning that she referred to? Or something more sacred, more binding? He burned the letter right there under the tree, letting the wind carry its ashes down toward the river. But he knew it wasn't over. Not yet. That afternoon, he returned to the village square where preparations for the yam feast had reached their most colorful. Children ran barefoot, chalk patterns drawn on their cheeks, while women danced in wrappers dyed deep indigo and red, their anklets chiming like laughter. Ezeku spotted Mama Ifanania, the old midwife who was rumored to know how to speak with the dead. She stood by a stall of kola nuts, her eyes milky with age but sharp as flint. He approached her cautiously, bowed, and whispered, "Mama, if a spirit sends messages, how do we know when it's ready to rest?" She didn't answer at first. Instead, she placed a kola nut in his hand and said, "When the living release the spirit from their guilt, and the dead release the living from their grief, only then." Ezeku swallowed. That night, he sat again under the akbakoro tree, holding Igioma's hand in one and Chinello's last letter in the other. And for the first time, he whispered aloud, "Forgive me for living." The wind shifted, warm and sweet, carrying with it the scent of frangipani and the sound of distant singing. He closed his eyes, unsure if the tears that followed were sorrow or relief or maybe both. The night air felt unusually still after Ezeku's whispered confession beneath the akbakoro tree, as though even the spirits were holding their breath. Igioma, quiet but watchful, had sensed something shifting in him, though she said nothing. When they walked back home hand in hand, the letter was gone now, ashes fed to the earth, but its final words throbbed in his memory. Like a drumbeat in the distance, "You are almost free." That phrase clung to him through the following days, even as the Yam festival blossomed into full celebration, and the village danced beneath hanging lanterns carved from dried gourds. But freedom, he realized, was not something a spirit handed to you. It had to be claimed. One morning, as roosters crowed and the aroma of boiling ogbano soup drifted from the neighbor's compound, Ezeku rose early and made his way to the small shrine that lay at the edge of the village, hidden behind thorny bushes and whispered stories. It was a place he hadn't dared visit since Chinello's burial, and its entrance was guarded by the stone-carved face of Ayla, the earth goddess. He knelt without offering, without pride. "If her voice still moves between worlds," he said quietly, "then let her see me now, not as a broken man, not as a guilty husband, but as one who still carries her with every breath." The ground did not shake, the trees did not sing, but he felt it, a warmth in his chest, not unlike the way her palm had once rested against his heart when he could not sleep. Later that day, a young boy ran breathless to his courtyard, a letter in hand. Ezeku froze. But this time, the envelope was unmarked, plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. Opening it slowly, he read, "She has spoken. It is time." There was no signature, but at the bottom was pressed a dried petal from an ofo tree, Chinello's favorite. He turned to Igioma, who had watched the entire exchange from the doorway. "I need to go back," he said softly, "to where she was buried." Igioma didn't flinch. She walked over and took his hand in hers. "Then we will go together." And so they traveled that afternoon, the wind soft on their faces, the road lined with yellow bush daisies, and the faraway cry of hornbills echoing in the canopy above. They reached the old burial grove by twilight. The headstone was cracked, vines growing through the etched name. But the moment he knelt and laid the petal at its base, a hush fell over the clearing, and the wind carried a familiar fragrance, wood smoke and hibiscus, just as it had on their wedding night. Ezeku bowed his head. "I release you, Chinello, and I forgive myself." A peace settled over him like a woven cloth, warm and final. And somewhere, unseen, a woman's laughter danced with the wind, brief but whole. As Ezeku and Igioma walked back from the old grove beneath the hush of a darkening sky, the trail behind them grew thick with the low calls of crickets and the rustling of palm fronds. Stirred by ancestral winds, the burden Ezeku had carried for so long seemed to fall behind them, left among the vines and soil where Chinello now rested in peace. They did not speak for a while. There was nothing urgent left to say. Their silence was not emptiness but healing. When they reached the compound, the air smelled of charcoal smoke and ripe pawpaw and mamankechi. The neighbor waved at them with her hands stained red from palm oil. The ordinary world had continued, but something had changed in the tilt of it for Ezeku. That night, he lit a lantern and sat beneath the veranda where Chinello used to plait her hair. In the fading light, the wooden box that had once held all her letters still sat on the shelf, undisturbed. For the first time, he opened it not with fear or longing, but with a soft reverence, like one dusting off a sacred drum. Inside were the letters, the dried petals, and one final envelope he had never noticed before, thinner, paler, almost translucent, as though waiting until now to be seen. It was dated 3 days before her death. He opened it slowly. The paper trembled in his fingers, but his heart stayed still. "If this reaches you," it began, "it means I have truly gone. And yet, You are still reading my voice. Ezeku, my son, don't you see? The letters were not just mine, they were yours. I only reminded you of what you already knew. That grief is not a prison unless you build the walls yourself. And love, real love, asks not for you to stop living when it ends but to carry it onward, like a sacred song in your blood. I chose to leave these words behind, not to haunt, but to guide. Now you are free. Free to feel joy again, to laugh again, to love again. I will always walk beside you, in the way wind leans through plantain leaves silent. But here, Ezeku folded the letter slowly, tears in his eyes. But this time, they did not sting, they soothed. He rose and stepped outside. Ijeoma stood, in the moonlight, wearing a soft yellow wrapper and holding a carved wooden bowl of warm roasted groundnuts. She smiled gently, not as a replacement for Chinello, but as herself, as someone who had waited patiently for a man to find his way through. Shadow. Ezeku took the bowl from her hands, their fingers brushing. Thank you, he said, for staying. She tilted her head, the moon glinting off her earrings. We stay for the ones we believe in. And as they sat together, quietly cracking shells beneath the stars, the past didn't vanish, it simply found a place to rest. By morning, the rain had come softly, tapping against the clay rooftops like a patient drummer waking the village with a lullaby instead of a roar. The soil smelled richer, darker, like it had soaked in not only water but memory. Ezeku stood beneath the mango tree outside his compound, watching the ripples gather in the shallow puddles near his feet. Inside the house, the letterbox sat closed, not abandoned, but no longer sacred in its mystery. Ijeoma moved about the kitchen, humming a tune Chinello used to sing while peeling yam. There was no strangeness in it now, only a sense that the song had found a new voice, and the home, a new breath. When Ezeku came back in, wiping his hands on his wrapper, he noticed something unexpected. A small girl, no older than 6 or 7, standing barefoot at the edge of the veranda with a folded paper clutched in her hands. Her hair was done in careful braids, beads clinking as she shifted nervously, eyes wide and curious. "Uncle," she said softly, "Mama sent this for you." Ezeku knelt to her level, brow furrowed but heart steady. "Your mama?" The girl nodded. She said to give it to the man who keeps hearing from the wind. He gently took the note and opened it. There was no signature, no handwriting like Chinello's, but instead a charcoal drawing of a tree with roots spiraling deep underground and branches stretching into the clouds. At the bottom, scrawled in a child's uncertain strokes, was the phrase, "Keep growing." Ijeoma stepped beside him, laying a hand on his shoulder. The girl smiled once more, then ran off, vanishing into the village path between the cassava bushes. They sat on the veranda once again, not speaking, letting the morning wrap around them in silence. The drawing fluttered in Ezeku's hand like a leaf ready to be planted. "Maybe," he said after a long pause, "we've only been looking at this life through one window." Ijeoma leaned her head on his shoulder. "And now you're opening the door." The sun pushed through the rain clouds then, casting a slow gold over the earth, as if blessing the new chapter before it had even begun. Somewhere in the fields, the drums from a distant naming ceremony echoed faintly, promising new beginnings, reminding them both that stories do not end when people die, they ripple forward, carried in voices, in drawings, in the footsteps of little girls sent by dreams. Ezeku looked again at the sketch and nodded to himself. He would hang it in the main room not because it came from Chinello, but because it spoke to something she had always believed, that even in grief, something beautiful can grow. That evening, as the orange twilight draped itself across the palm-lined horizon, Ezeku sat cross-legged on the woven mat in the main room. The charcoal sketch now framed in wood and leaning gently against the wall beside Chinello's last photograph. The scent of pepper soup simmering over the fire mingled with the faint incense Igioma had lit, an old ritual Chinello used to observe on quiet evenings. Outside, children's laughter spilled from the path near the well, and the rustle of maize leaves whispered like distant voices remembering. Ezeku's thoughts, however, were centered on the little girl with the drawing, the way her eyes seemed to carry an understanding. Too old for her age, he hadn't seen her since, but something about her presence lingered in the corners of the compound, like the echo of a lullaby he'd forgotten but still knew how to hum. He unfolded an old notebook Chinello had once used to scribble her thoughts, and began writing not a letter, but something else, a kind of message to the silence, to the living, to himself. "I do not know if you still send these messages," he wrote, "or if the wind only carries what we need to hear. But today, your roots held me, and I felt less afraid." As he closed the book, Igioma entered with 2 calabashes of warm millet drink, setting them beside him with a tired smile, and sitting down without a word. They clinked the gourds together gently, like an unspoken prayer. After a while, she said, "Do you think she sent that child?" Ezeku looked up at the shadowed ceiling, where lizards made lazy paths across the mud plaster. "I think, maybe, she sent the story, and the story found the child." Igioma nodded slowly, as though this made perfect sense. Outside, the wind stirred again, this time more like a breeze than a whisper, and the wind chimes long neglected sang their brittle lullaby for the first time in years. That night, Ezeku dreamt of a garden, not the wild one behind the house, but a vast, dreamlike space filled with baobab trees and floating seeds that never landed. Chinello was there, not speaking, only planting a seed with each step, and smiling at him in that quiet way she used to when she knew something he didn't. He woke with tears drying in the corners of his eyes, but his chest no longer felt like it was made of stone. The letters had stopped, perhaps, but her voice hadn't. It had simply changed its path through children, through drawings, through dreams, and in that, he knew she hadn't left. Not really. Just transformed. Just continued. The next morning, the air in Umuahia was thick with the promise of rain, and the skies hung low like swollen thoughts waiting to break. Ezeku rose before the birds stirred, stepping into the cool dawn barefoot, letting the earth greet him like an old friend. The dream lingered behind his eyes, Chinello among the baobabs, planting quiet seeds, and he felt compelled to follow it. Without telling Igioma, he gathered his wrapper and a satchel of cola nuts and left the compound, his footsteps leading him toward the village edge where the old path split into the forest trail. The same path he and Chinello used to walk on moonlit nights to collect herbs and tell stories. The trees had grown denser since she passed, vines curling like secrets over old stumps. But his feet knew the way. As he walked, he spoke softly to the air, as if she were beside him, of the dream, of the child's drawing, of the way his chest felt lighter and his nights less suffocating. Hours passed, and then, like a spirit had led him there, he came upon the forgotten grove where Chinello had once buried a wooden box. Beneath a white-flowered udala tree, he remembered her saying, "If the day ever comes that my voice can't reach you, find the tree that smells of home." He dropped to his knees and began to dig with his hands, dirt lodging under his nails, heart thudding with something between dread and hope. When his fingers hit wood, he paused. The box was old but untouched by rot, bound with twine the color of ochre. Inside it were pages of letters he had never seen. Dozens. Some unfinished. Some smudged with what might have been tears or rain. All written in Chinello's flowing hand. One by one, he opened them, reading beneath the swaying canopy. As the sky finally broke open above him, sending rain down in gentle sheets. She had written them for after, for birthdays, for dark nights, for the day he'd fall in love again. One letter, marked only with a red bead, simply read, "When the world becomes too quiet, plant your feet and listen. I will be in the roots." Ezeku pressed the letter to his chest and sobbed, letting the rain fall on his face like an anointing. When he finally stood, he didn't take the letters. He reburied the box, added fresh flowers to the Udala's base, and walked back to the village soaked, shivering, and changed. Ijeoma saw him return from the doorway and said nothing, only took his hand and brought him inside. That night, the rain sang a lullaby, and in his sleep, Ezeku dreamt of roots glowing beneath the ground alive, connected, whispering his name. The morning after the rain, Umuahia smelled of wet red earth and hibiscus, a stillness settling over the rooftops like a held breath. Ezeku woke to the sound of pounding yam in a mortar outside, the rhythmic thud pulling him gently from sleep. Like a lullaby reversed, Ijeoma was already up, her laughter floating in from the courtyard where she teased young Abube about his lopsided drawing of a crocodile. For the first time in what felt like years, Ezeku's chest did not ache upon waking. He moved slowly, stretching his arms toward the cracked ceiling and whispering a quiet greeting to the morning. The memories of the Udala tree, the letters, and Chinello's voice still rooted themselves deeply in him, but no longer like thorns, more like the grounding pulse of a distant drum, steady and warm. As he stepped outside, the village seemed to welcome him anew. Neighbors greeted him with nods that lingered longer. The old women at the well paused their gossip and blessed him under their breath. Even Nana, the stubborn palm wine tapper, offered him the first cup from his fresh harvest, a gesture usually reserved for elders. Ezeku took it with both hands and a quiet dalu. In the afternoon, under the shade of the old Iroko, Ezeku began writing again. Not a letter, not a eulogy, but a story, his story. He wrote about Chinello, yes, but also about how the dead speak in ways the living often forget to hear. He wrote about the dreams, the silences, the letters, and the ache of healing. Ijeoma brought him boiled groundnuts and said nothing, only watching as his fingers moved across the page like someone casting a net into water, hoping to pull up something sacred. Children gathered nearby, playing with carved wooden animals, and one of them, a girl with beads in her hair, asked him if he believed ghosts were real. He paused, then smiled gently and said, "Some spirits stay not to haunt, but to hold us while we find our way." That night, as crickets sang from the bush and the moon hung full like a watchful eye, Ezeku sat beside Ijeoma on the veranda. They didn't speak of love or death or the letters buried beneath the Udala tree. They simply sat, her fingers brushing his knuckles, his breath slow and steady, watching the stars tremble above the palm trees. Chinello's presence lingered in the quiet moments, not as a shadow, but as something tender and guiding. Ezeku did not know if more letters would come. He no longer waited by the door. What mattered now was that something had shifted. The living had opened a space for the dead, and the dead had offered their blessing in return. That same night, after Ijeoma had gone inside and the lantern had been dimmed, Ezeku remained on the veranda with the hum of the forest wrapping around him like a shawl. The stars above blinked gently, and the moon dipped lower, casting soft silver onto the dusty path that led to the Udala tree. Something stirred in him, not fear, Not urgency, but a tug, like a thread being gently pulled from the hem of his spirit. He rose, barefoot, the soles of his feet silent against the cool earth, and walked toward the grove behind the compound. The udala tree stood there as always, quiet and immense, its gnarled branches holding centuries of secrets. He placed a palm against its trunk and whispered, "I am still listening." And then, as if summoned by memory itself, a breeze carried the faintest sound of paper brushing paper like dry leaves rustling in a stack. He turned and saw it, a letter, resting neatly at the base of the tree, wrapped in palm frond twine. His breath caught in his throat. For a moment he didn't move, simply stared as though the letter were a wild animal that might vanish if startled. Then slowly, reverently, he bent down and picked it up. It was her handwriting, Chinello's curves, and it's the way she always pressed to hard on the D and let her Y float. He didn't open it. Not yet. He sat cross-legged beneath the tree, letter resting on his thigh, and let his eyes close. In the darkness behind his eyelids, her voice came not as a whisper or echo, but as a song they once danced to during harmattan season, barefoot and breathless in their youth. When love was loud and the world was small, the letter stayed unopened until dawn, when the birds began to stir and the first cock crowed in the neighboring compound. Only then did he unbind the twine and unfold the paper, his hands trembling but calm. Inside was a short message, no more than a few lines, but it carried the weight of oceans. "My spirit is lighter now. Yours is too. When you write stories, I am with you. When you laugh, I am the echo. Let the tree rest now. Let me rest too." Tears slid silently down his face, not from grief, but from gratitude, the kind that fills a man like rain fills a calabash left out in the yard. He pressed the letter to his chest, then folded it gently and placed it inside the old wooden box where all her letters lived. That morning, he told Igioma he would begin teaching children how to write stories. "Even ghosts deserve readers," he said with a crooked smile, and she laughed, wiping yam flour from her cheek. The udala tree stood quiet that day, as if in agreement, leaves shimmering gold in the sunlight. And for the first time, Ezeku didn't glance back. Later that week, the children came in twos and threes, barefoot and curious, whispering to each other as they approached the veranda of Ezeku's compound, where the old wooden table had been cleared and the lanterns polished bright. Word had spread quickly. Ezeku, the storyteller, the one whose wife wrote from the grave, was going to teach writing. Mothers with baskets on their heads paused to watch as their sons and daughters scribbled clumsy letters into sand with sticks, and the elders who once scoffed now lingered at the edges of the yard, pretending to inspect palm fronds while quietly listening. Igioma helped the smallest children, her calm presence keeping the laughter from getting too loud and the chalk from flying. Ezeku moved among them like a man who had remembered the joy of breathing, gently correcting a misshapen E, or helping a boy named Nana string his first sentence together, about a red goat and a missing mango. With each child who read aloud, Ezeku felt a piece of his spirit stitch itself back into place, not the man he was before Chinello's death, but a quieter, wiser version of that man, tempered by loss but not consumed by it. In the evenings, when the children had gone and the stars returned, he sat by the udala tree not to find letters, but to remember the rhythm of her voice. And sometimes he would hum their song just to hear it ripple in the silence. One evening, Nana returned alone, clutching a small paper folded in quarters. "Uncle," he said, shy but earnest, "I wrote something. Can I read it to the tree?" Ezeku blinked and nodded. unsure of why the request moved him so deeply. The boy stood before the udala tree, paper trembling in his hands, and read a simple tale of a woman who turned into a bird and sent songs down to her husband through the rain. When he finished, the wind stirred and a single ripe fruit dropped near the boy's feet. Nana picked it up with wide eyes and looked back at Ezeku. She liked it, the boy said with a grin. Ezeku chuckled, voice catching in his throat. Yes, he murmured. She has always loved a good story. That night, he opened the wooden box one last time and laid the letters out in front of him, not to read them, but to thank them. Chinelo, he whispered, your love didn't die, it changed shape. It became these children, this tree, these stories. Then, slowly, he began to burn the letters, one by one, under the udala's watchful shadow, the smoke curling like her spirit rising with the wind. As the final paper turned to ash, a sense of stillness settled across the compound, the kind that comes not from endings, but from peace. In the days that followed the final burning of Chinelo's letters, Ezeku walked through the village with a kind of softness in his step that people hadn't seen in years. It wasn't joy, exactly not the kind that dances loudly but a quiet fullness, like when the first rain finally soaks the cracked earth. The air in Umuahia was shifting. The dry season had begun to loosen its grip, and the scent of rain teased the nostrils like a forgotten lullaby. Children still came to the compound every afternoon, some to learn, some just to sit beneath the udala tree and listen. But more than that, something else had begun to grow. Ezeku found himself invited more often, first to small gatherings under moonlight, then to the storytelling circles once held only by the elder griots. When he sat among them, the others leaned in not with skepticism, but reverence. He told them Chinelo's tales now, not as letters from the grave, but as stories full of magic, humility, and the persistence of love. And with each retelling, he breathed life into her memory, not as grief, but as legacy. Ijeoma stood beside him through it all, quiet and luminous, her fingers weaving raffia mats while her ears drank in every word. One evening, as fireflies shimmered like distant stars and drums echoed faintly from another compound, she turned to Ezeku and asked softly, "Do you think she knew it would end this way?" Ezeku paused, his eyes searching the shadows beneath the tree, and then said, "She knew I needed to become something more than a widower, and she led me there with every word she left behind." There was a silence between them, warm and unhurried, and in that pause, something invisible but undeniable passed between their hearts' acknowledgement, maybe, or a beginning that neither of them would name yet. That night, for the first time in years, Ezeku dreamt not of the moment Chinelo died, but of the day they first met, when her laugh startled the birds into flight, and he thought, even then, that she might be some kind of spirit walking in a woman's body. When he awoke, the sun had only begun to climb, but he rose with the sense that the story was not over, it had simply changed its tone. He walked to the udala tree, touched the bark gently, and whispered, "Thank you," as a breeze fluttered the leaves above like applause. Then he sat down, took a fresh piece of paper, and began to write, not to Chinelo this time, but to the children who would someday ask how love can last beyond death, and how silence, if honored, can bloom into song. The letter Ezeku wrote that morning beneath the udala tree turned into many. Each day, after tending to his chores and greeting the neighbors with the quiet dignity he had become known for, he would return to that spot with a new sheet of paper, a freshly trimmed feather quill, and the ink he made himself from the bark of the ofo tree. What began as a note to the children of Umuahia soon became a series of small reflections on grief, on memory, on the nature of love that does not demand possession. The villagers started calling them Chinelo's echoes, though Ezeku never gave the letters a name. He simply folded them neatly and left them in a gourd basket tied with palm rope, under the veranda of the community hall, where anyone could come and take one. The youth came first, boys with curious eyes and restless fingers, girls who traced the cursive letters with wonder, but soon the elders came too, leaning on staffs and whispering to one another as if rediscovering the language of feelings long buried. Then one day, during the harmattan season, a woman Ezeku did not know came to his home. She was tall, with skin like polished mahogany and long gray braids wound into a loose coil. She introduced herself as a Danma, a storyteller from a coastal village beyond Owerri, who had heard of the letters and had walked for days to find the man who spoke with the dead. Not to ask questions, she said, her voice like woven cloth, but to listen. I believe your wife speaks through you still. Ezeku served her palm wine and roasted plantain, and they sat in the shade while the dry wind danced with the dust as the sun dipped behind the mango trees. A Danma told a story of her own about a girl who had once dreamed of learning the names of all the stars but died before she turned 16. Her mother, overcome with sorrow, built a shrine of mirrors to remember her, but every year a new one shattered. It wasn't until she spoke her daughter's name aloud to strangers that the breaking stopped. Ezeku closed his eyes as the meaning sank into his bones. Memory must move, must be shared to stay whole. That night, he invited a Danma to stay. For the first time since Chinalo died, another voice besides his own read aloud in the compound. A Danma read one of Chinelo's letters under the pale moon, her voice trembling, not with fear but reverence. And the village listened not with pity, but awe. The letters no longer belonged to sorrow. They had become a sacred kind of inheritance. Ezeku watched the firelight dance in a Danma's eyes, and he understood. Grief was not a prison, it was a road, and he was not walking it alone anymore. The letter Ezeku wrote that morning beneath the Udala tree turned into many. Each day, after tending to his chores and greeting the neighbors with the quiet dignity he had become known for, he would return to that spot with a new sheet of paper, a freshly trimmed feather quill, and the ink he made himself from the bark of the ofo tree. What began as a note to the children of Umuahia soon became a series of small reflections on grief, on memory, on the nature of love that does not demand possession. The villagers started calling them Chinelo's echoes, though Ezeku never gave the letters a name. He simply folded them neatly and left them in a gourd basket tied with palm rope, under the veranda of the community hall, where anyone could come and take one. The youth came first, boys with curious eyes and restless fingers, girls who traced the cursive letters with wonder, but soon the elders came too, leaning on staffs and whispering to one another as if rediscovering the language of feelings long buried. Then one day, during the harmattan season, a woman Ezeku did not know came to his home. She was tall, with skin like polished mahogany and long gray braids wound into a loose coil. She introduced herself as a Danma, a storyteller from a coastal village beyond Owerri, who had heard of the letters and had walked for days to find the man who spoke with the dead. Not to ask questions, she said, her voice like woven cloth, but to listen. I believe your wife speaks through you still. Ezeku served her palm wine and roasted plantain, and they sat in the shade while the dry wind danced with the dust as the sun dipped behind the mango trees. A Danma told a story of her own about a girl who had once dreamed of learning the names of all the stars but died before she turned 16. Her mother, overcome with sorrow, built a shrine of mirrors to remember her, but every year, a new one shattered. It wasn't until she spoke her daughter's name aloud to strangers that the breaking stopped. Ezeku closed his eyes as the meaning sank into his bones. Memory must move, must be shared to stay whole. That night, he invited Adanma to stay. For the first time since Chinalo died, another voice besides his own read aloud in the compound. Adanma read one of Chinalo's letters under the pale moon, her voice trembling, not with fear but reverence, and the village listened not with pity, but awe. The letters no longer belonged to sorrow. They had become a sacred kind of inheritance. Ezeku watched the firelight dance in Adanma's eyes, and he understood. Grief was not a prison, it was a road, and he was not walking it alone anymore. The next morning, Ezeku rose before the sun, stirred by the echo of Adanma's voice still laced through the branches of his dreams. The air was cool and fragrant with dew, and the earth beneath his bare feet hummed with a quiet promise. He stepped out onto the veranda, and there, to his astonishment, sat a row of villagers, young, old, tall, bent, quiet, all waiting patiently with folded hands and woven mats. Word of Adanma's reading had spread faster than harmattan winds, and now the people wanted more. Not just to hear Chinalo's letters, but to write their own. Letters to the gone, to the unborn, to forgotten fathers and lost sons, to women who vanished into the bush during childbirth and boys who drowned during the floods. Ezeku stood still, heart tight in his chest, until Adanma emerged behind him with 2 gourds of warm millet porridge. She gave him a look that said, "You must let them." And so, by the time the sun broke through the banana fronds, the courtyard had transformed into something sacred, a circle of woven mats and low stools, old bamboo baskets filled with paper, dried ink pods, feathers, and charcoal sticks. Adanma called it the listening ground. People came, not to be instructed, but to sit in silence first, to listen for what their hearts still carried. Then, slowly, letters began to form, some in clumsy handwriting, others in elegant and Sabiti symbols, some dictated by trembling lips and written down by younger hands. One old woman named Mama Ifeoma sobbed as she dictated a letter to her twin sister who had died 50 years ago in the war. A little boy wrote to a grandfather he never met but missed in his dreams. The letters were not mailed, nor burned, nor buried. They were placed in a giant clay pot that Adanma called the spirit gourd, which sat beneath the udala tree, wrapped in red cloth and cowrie shells. "Let them rest there," she said, "where the living and the dead can meet." That evening, as chickens clucked lazily and the smell of egusi soup drifted through the village, Ezeku felt something lift inside him, as though Chinalo's presence was no longer a whisper from another world, but a thread that wove through everyone. His grief had seeded a forest. Later, sitting beside Adanma under the stars, he finally asked the question that had burned quietly in his chest for weeks. "Do you think she sent you?" Adanma smiled without looking at him, tracing a finger through the dust. "She said you would need a voice that wasn't only your own." And with that, she handed him a folded paper, a letter he hadn't written. It was Chinalo's handwriting. Somehow, still, he opened it, hands trembling, eyes wide, and inside, only 3 words: "Keep listening, love." Night deepened across the village of Odu, and the udala tree glowed faintly under the moonlight, its leaves rustling like whispers from another world. Ezeku sat on the low wooden bench outside his hut, the latest letter from Chinalo still open. On his lap, the ink smudged at the corners from the trembling of his hands. Around him, the listening ground had emptied for the night, but the spirit gourd remained, wrapped in its ceremonial red cloth, pulsing with the quiet weight of so many hopes and goodbyes. Adanma sat cross-legged nearby, staring at the stars, her face serene yet unreadable, as though she had long ago learned to live between silences. Ezeku finally spoke, his voice low. "When I was younger, I thought death was a closed gate, final, sharp, like a machete strike." Adanma turned her head, saying nothing, only listening. He continued, "But now it feels like a door that doesn't quite latch. Things pass through. Sounds, feelings, even letters." She nodded slowly. "Sometimes we forget that our ancestors didn't bury the dead to say goodbye. They buried them to give them a place to listen from." A soft breeze stirred, and the wind chime made from goat bones and bottle caps sang its strange little tune. Suddenly, the clay pot beneath the tree let out a faint sound, not quite a knock, more like a soft echo of tapping. Both of them froze. Ezeku stood and approached it cautiously. When he lifted the lid, a folded piece of bark parchment lay inside. It hadn't been there earlier. His heart pounded as he unfolded it. The handwriting was not Chinello's. It was shakier, angular, still familiar. It was his own, yet he had not written it. Adanma stepped closer and looked over his shoulder. The message was short. "You are becoming the message." Ezeku's knees gave a little, and he sat down hard on the ground, staring at the words as if they might rearrange into something more sensible. But they didn't. Instead, they burned into his chest like warm fire. Adanma didn't ask him to explain. She only whispered, "The dead are not behind us. They are beneath us, watching us build the world." That night, Ezeku couldn't sleep. He watched Adanma breathe steadily beside the hearth, and in the shadows cast by the fire, he began writing not to Chinello, but to the ones who would come after him, to his daughter, Nkiru, who had left for a new gu and barely wrote, to the child of Nkiru, yet unborn, to the next custodian of the spirit gourd. For the first time in many moons, the grief no longer sat on his shoulders like a clay idol. It flowed through him, became water, became ink, and with each word, he knew the story was no longer just his. It had entered the soil. The rooster crowed far too early, or so it seemed, but Ezeku was already awake, seated in the center of the listening ground with his legs folded, and the final letter resting in his palms like a feathered egg about to hatch. Smoke curled from the dying fire, and the sun rose slowly behind the udala tree, casting golden fingers across the village, as if to bless the last chapter of a story told in silence and bark parchment. Adanma stood a few paces away, holding the spirit gourd as reverently as a midwife holds a firstborn. Round them, elders began to gather, not because they'd been summoned, but because something in the air, in the soil, had shifted. The final letter, smaller than the others, was wrapped not in cloth, but in braided strands of Chinello's old hair she'd once cut during the season of mourning, braided by Ezeku's own hands long ago. He didn't need to read it aloud. The message pulsed in his chest before his eyes met the page. "You are ready. My silence is your inheritance." There were no other words, no signature, no goodbye. Ezeku pressed the letter against his heart, then gently passed it to Adanma. She nodded once and placed it inside the hollow of the spirit gourd. Then, with a voice steady as thunderclouds holding back rain, she chanted the farewell rites, not to Chinello, not even to the ancestors, but to the story itself. As her voice rose, the udala tree trembled faintly and its fruit began to fall, one by one. Soft thuds in the grass like the punctuation marks of fate. Ezeku took a deep breath and reached into the fire's edge. smearing a line of ash across his forehead. "Today, I become the quiet," he said, and his voice did not crack. For the first time in years, he did not feel like a man waiting for death to knock again. He felt like a man who had finished listening. The elders approached him, placing coal and nuts and ground chalk at his feet. Kira arrived late, dust on her shoes and questions in her eyes. But she saw her father standing tall, holding nothing and yet everything, and she fell to her knees beside him. He did not speak. He didn't need to. The story had folded into them both. As the sun climbed higher and the last fruit of the Udala tree dropped to the earth, a gust of wind lifted the ashes from the fire into the sky. They spiraled like gray birds, dancing between worlds, then disappeared. The spirit gourd was sealed and buried beneath the listening ground, not as a grave but as a root. The letters would no longer rive, and yet they would never stop speaking. Not in that village, not in that bloodline, not in the echo of a woman's love that refused to die. Even when she did,